My dog passed away 2 months ago, yet she still wakes me up in the middle of the night. I can still recall the beginning of it all, the sweating, the scratching, the nightmares. The same thing kept happening every night. What the devil did I do to deserve this? Why did it happen to me? My dog Apollo passed away about a month ago, and I almost lost it. I realize this may sound dramatic, but he was my best friend and only relative. My mom passed away 12 years before I had him, and my dad joined her shortly after. Apollo entered my life at a time when I needed someone to assist me deal with the flood of emotions coursing through my body since life had been difficult. He was a blessing, my angel, and most of all, someone who would listen to me. He was my best friend, and he always appeared to sit and listen to whatever I said. I never complained. He followed me everywhere, and I gave him everything in exchange for listening to me, but nothing could ever take more from me than life. That I've discovered that the more you appreciate life's little pleasures, the more it relishes in seeing you suffer as it tears away the things you value most. One of the most difficult things to witness would have been entering the living room and seeing Apollo's corpse. I eventually got a shovel after all the sobbing, and I buried him in my backyard. Each time I pierced the dirt, it hurt less than the last time I covered his lifeless body until the ground was all that was left beneath me. The weight of my parents and my dog placed a great deal of strain on me, and it took me over a week to return to a relatively regular living. I felt as though I was carrying a life filled with pain and fear everywhere I went. I was done, my spirit had lost its life and the world had lost its color. I continued to live my life normally, but every morning became more difficult and sluggish. I would dream every other night that my parents were watching me play with Apollo. I could swear that everything was real for a second when I was in paradise, but then I would wake up with a huge smile on my face. This never-ending cycle of dreams continued on the same pattern: sleep, paradise, nightmare, wake up. I would occasionally wake asleep and swear I could hear my parents laughing and Apollo's faint bark, but then there would be stillness. I didn't realize the stillness was starting to shatter until a month following these nightmares. I woke up in my bed one night following the dreams and noticed that it was about 3:30 a.m. when I checked the time. The buzzing of the fan above served as a reminder of my location, but the fuzz of my once solidified eyes made it difficult to perceive my surroundings. I thought about the fake memories I had just made up in my mind while feeling isolated in the pitch-black emptiness of my bedroom. With nothing but darkness gazing back at me, I looked around my room and rested my head on my pillow in the hopes of revisiting the scene from which I had been snatched. When I heard something cut through the nighttime silence like a boat cutting through the waves, the silence started to engulf me. A slight chuff came from what sounded like my hallway. I swore I heard it, but it was difficult to hear anything so faint because the door was closed. I opened my eyes wide and remained motionless, hoping to hear the sound once more. After a minute, I heard a soft shuffling sound as someone moved toward the door down my hallway. It sounded like it was creeping, but it was sluggish. My room was occasionally filled with the sound of something tapping on the wooden floor, which sounded like an animal's nail. When I heard a chuff again, this time coming from the left frame of the door, I listened intently. How could a dog have entered my home, even though it sounded just like a dog? Apollo was the only one who could open the dog door that I had purchased. I had left the collar in the grave with him, but a chip in his collar made the door open. As I waited for another sound to emerge from the other side of the door, my mind was racing with ideas. Since the thoughts functioned as coffee, I was never able to sleep and never felt fatigued. Although I wanted to claim it was a dream and that I would wake up, the truth was that I was awake and, more significantly, not by myself. I remained up for hours until I could see faint sunbeams peeking through my drapes. With my feet resting on the floor next to my bed, I made the decision to get out of bed and get ready. My concerns had decreased as the night went on since there had been no further sounds. Since this was not the first time I had heard sounds coming only from my brain, I attempted to remain realistic even though I was still unable to fall asleep. This was no different from the times I woke up and heard what sounded like Apollo and my parents. I got out of bed and started toward the door, but I stopped in sheer terror. I heard a loud shriek about 2 steps in, and then there was a panicked scurrying down my hallway. All night long, whatever the devil I had heard was there. I could literally feel the blood moving quickly through my body, and it burned. For what felt like an hour, the knowledge struck me so strongly that I dared not move. What sort of creature would have just sat there all night doing something, God knows what? The hallway was deserted when I eventually plucked up the nerve to unlock my door. A damp puddle appeared on my foot as I started to descend. I took a step back and stared at what appeared to be a water bottles full of saliva in disgust that I couldn't understand how it could be that a dog of some kind had gotten in and was lost, even if my rational thinking told me that it had. I continued walking down in search of additional answers, and everything was as it should have been. Ensuring that everything was in its proper position and that the dog door appeared just as it had always done. The drool was genuine, even if I wanted to claim it was all in my brain. Going through my day, assuming that whatever it was had just gotten lost and was now back home, seemed like the best way to get through the night. Throughout the day, everything proceeded as usual, and I gradually started to forget what had happened the night before. I always felt that thinking about my family helped me forget about whatever was going on. I made sure everything was closed and switched off the TV as night fell. I completed my nighttime ritual when I was pleased, and before I knew it, I was sound asleep. I must have slept for hours when I woke up to the sound of a howl. A powerful wail that lasted for at least 3 seconds and sent a tremor through my body. In a matter of seconds, the day that had been normal quickly reverted to the nightmare I had experienced the previous evening. With a startling discovery, I quickly glanced at the door and saw that it was still open. I was so exhausted from my day and the lack of sleep that I dozed out before I could even lock the door to my room. Now, I sat there staring at the crack that protected me from whatever the heck was in my house. After what seemed like hours, I could feel the arms supporting me start to shake like a building's foundation during an earthquake. Even though I knew that any sound or movement may bring whatever howled closer to me, my body started to feel heavy that I heard something scuffing around in the living room the previous evening, with the occasional chuff. The noise level was really high, and I could hear cups rattling on top of the table in the center of the living room. I got up as quietly as I could and carefully made my way to the door. I was afraid to glance around as I reached the doorframe, but I wanted to get this creature out of my house. Everything suggested that it was a dog, so I had to exercise caution, particularly if it was a stray or a larger dog that may attack me. I gently glanced around the frame, my pulse racing, to the dimly lit living room from the dark hallway. The table was now angled due to the creature's movements, and the carpet appeared to have been relocated. I was shivering as I moved carefully down the corridor and heard a faint painting coming from the room's right side. I was just 4 feet from the hallway's entrance to the living room when I suddenly smelled something so strong it made me gag. The smell was a hell-bent combination of decaying flesh, vomit, and excrement. For a while, I had to stand against the wall and breathe in the strong scents until the dog feeder's beep brought my focus back to the room in front of me. I hadn't heard that sound in the 2 months that Apollo hadn't been here, so memories came flooding back. I recall being enthralled with his collar's technology when the pet store employee described how the collar's chip could turn on the food dispenser and dog door when necessary. Then it dawned on me, how could this gadget have that chip? The only plausible explanation was that Apollo had dug himself out of the grave and crept back into the home for a final visit, but this was most definitely the last explanation and it wasn't true. The collar may have been dug up by this monster, but no animal could have been intelligent enough to understand how it operated. Dog food being consumed. I was still traveling with more questions racing through my mind and the animal made a creaking sound from the ground beneath my feet. The food ceased to move, and the house fell silent once more. Then a shadow moved slowly toward the hallway's entrance and came to a stop before it could be seen. I waited, frozen with wonder and anxiety, hoping that if it glanced down, it may not be able to see my surroundings. I could hear the faint breathing of the animal just on the other side of the wall, so the shadow lingered there for a while before moving forward once more. I heard a dog sniffing and could see the end of its snout emerging from the shadows. I began to lean slightly in an attempt to get a better look, but it rushed loudly to the dog door in a split second. I started to sprint to the opening, but my reaction time was slow, and I saw the dog door close after the burglar. I hurried to the door and opened it, only to be greeted by the chilly night air. Just when I was beginning to believe that a significant quantity of food had been consumed and that the faint odor from the dog's presence was still there, I turned around to search for any hints. There was a boiling heap of crap in the center of the floor when I went to inspect the kitchen. I was appalled by what I saw and proceeded to get some supplies to clean it up when I noticed something strange. There was too much excrement for a dog to handle. For 12 long years, I had to clean up after Apollo, a big dog, but this was something else. I was perplexed and uneasy by the human-sized feces, even though everything I had heard pointed to it being a dog. Given how late it was, I made the decision to ignore the odd sight and tidy up before returning to my bed and making sure everything was closed. To ensure that whatever it was could not re-enter, I placed a nearby box against the dog door this time. Even though I had a difficult time sleeping that night, I was able to get some sleep thanks to the box's additional security, which protected both the dog and me outside. I spent the next few days looking for answers to the strange things that had happened the previous evenings. Was it really Apollo who returned, or did something manage to slip inside? Perhaps it was the intense desire to see my best friend once again, but I knew it was not going to happen. I dumped the dirt on the dog I used to play with. I saw his lifeless corpse on that floor, and I saw my closest friend's hazy eyes being covered in the cold earth. I kept asking the same questions during the days, and the evenings made my life even more confusing. It would take me a while to fall asleep, and I would seal my door before bed, wondering whether the burglar would return and pay a visit. Sometimes I thought I could hear it back at home, and a single squeak would wake me up. On certain mornings, I would see that the box was pushed forward a little, as though something was attempting to enter, or that it had been put back into position to make it appear normal. I never felt comfortable with the idea of it being in my home when I was sleeping. As things appeared to gradually return to normal, the same waking terror started to resurface in the nightmares. That's how I wish things had remained. Returning to my routine felt good in a way and gave me a sense of happiness that I hadn't had in a while. After returning home, I took some time to unwind on my couch before the night took over. I decided to prepare my favorite supper and watch my favorite movie after feeling a little happier. It was the best day I had yet to have since Duration Apollo was there. I washed the dishes after I finished eating and looked out into the backyard, imagining my friend was back there, sleeping and presumably at peace. Maybe I could start viewing it as a joyful reminder of the wonderful memories rather than the unpleasant ones I had lately formed. I never looked back there because it only made me unhappy. It was chilly outdoors, and to be honest, I've been afraid to walk outside at night ever since the dog moved in. I went to the light switch and turned on the exterior lights so I could see the grave and perhaps find some closure to round off the day. When I saw a little mound of earth next to the grave, my eyes strained to adjust to the hard darkness of the night. My entire being was overcome with fear, and I did my best to comprehend. Sweating, I dashed to the grave from the rear entrance. There it was, the once-filled burial in the once-occupied Apollo space, now empty except for earthworms. I must have had a nightmare, a lengthy, detailed nightmare conjured up in my messed-up mind. My nose captured the perspiration that was dripping from my forehead and caused it to flow to my lips. Did Apollo survive? Was I being haunted by a demon of some sort? Only the footprints of hands or paws made up the dirt mound next to the tomb. There were no indications of a shovel. That I must have had a nightmare, a lengthy, detailed nightmare conjured up in my messed-up mind. My nose captured the perspiration that was dripping from my forehead and caused it to flow to my lips. Did Apollo survive? Was I being haunted by a demon of some sort? Only the footprints of hands or paws made up the dirt mound next to the tomb. There were no indications of a shovel. I hurried back to my place, slammed the door, and was sweating and painting, my mind racing with every conceivable idea. What I originally believed to be my dog turned out to be something else, and it had been living with me. To the best of my knowledge, it had been entering without my knowledge. Now that I couldn't even sleep, I stood there wondering how everything that had happened could be genuine. At that moment, I felt my blood freeze at the sound of a whimper. When I heard the soft whine of a dog, or something that sounded like a dog, in the distance, my entire body seemed to stop. A half-human visage was staring back at me as I cautiously raised my head to look into the corridor. Based on his height, I could infer that he was on his hands and knees, with only half of his face visible behind the wall. I could only see what appeared to be the skull of Apollo on his head, with pieces of his decaying flesh still attached. The man's eyes were able to see through all the skin in the empty sockets, and he frowned at me while continuing to moan. He was surrounded by flies, and the stench steadily made its way to me, just as strong as it had been the previous evening. With a loud smash of his knees and palms hitting the floor, he swiftly fled into the hall after noticing my horrified and disgusted expression. It was racing. This guy had desecrated my dog's grave while he was at my door, pretending like my dog. The idea of a man racing through my house 10 feet away from me while drooling on my floor and wearing my dog's rotting skin made me want to throw up. My body would not move, and I had no idea what kind of twisted game this man was playing or what state of mind he was in. He had discovered this collar, which brought him straight into my home. He pretended to be my dog, my only friend, and took sick delight in it. If I had just learned to move my legs, I started to walk to the doorframe as soon as I heard a scratching sound coming from the kitchen. This must have been pure adrenaline. When I eventually reached the door frame, I noticed the man's distorted figure scratching at my door. Drool was streaming from his tongue and creating a pool of slimy liquid on the floor as he was pushed up on his knees and scratching at the door to my bedroom picture. I could see that the collar was tight around his neck, causing his veins to protrude. He was hairy and his body was filthy, the rotting tail of Apollo was stapled to his back at his rear, and he was bare. His nails were all long, and there were clumps of fetus lodged in his hair. I needed a technique to defend myself against a man who might overtake me. I couldn't help but stare at him even though I didn't have a pistol and the only weapon I had was a kitchen knife. What had I seen of him now? It took everything I had not to vomit on the floor in front of me, since it was the most repulsive thing I had ever seen. He stared at him for a few seconds before turning to me and yelling. All he did was gaze at me while he started to shake his ass to mimic the wagging of the tail that was stapled to him. That I had never seen a human with dog-like looks, but here he was. It was hard to remember that this was a guy, a grown man, behaving like a puppy while you were staring at him. He might have been observing me for weeks, but it was impossible to determine how long he had been doing this. This wasn't a dog, but I still wanted to run him out of my house. Would he do that now that he was an adult? He gave me such a naive look that it made me think of Apollo's gaze on me. The man merely gazed at me, observing and anticipating, and I reciprocated. My only idea was to dash to the kitchen and grab the knife. Everything else would depend on the man's actions. The only problem is that he could easily overwhelm me. If I went up to him in the hallway, I would have to divert his attention. I swallowed my disgust and concluded that playing along with his little game was the best way to solve the problem. I whistled in his direction and yelled, "Hey buddy, are you lost?" The man at the end of the hall cocked his head in interest and gave a loud bark in return that was so lifelike it made my blood run. I spotted an old bone belonging to Apollo while exploring the area, and I promptly picked it up and showed it to him. "Come on, buddy. We may now play, even though I know you must be afraid. Hurry up." He approached me gently as he crawled down the corridor after patting my knees to signal for him to come. I continued to whistle and wave the bone at him as I slowly retreated, being careful to keep out of his reach. I was frightened as I watched the man approach, his labored breathing becoming more and more audible with each thump of his knees against the floor. I threw the bone a few feet away from him, and he swiftly shuffled to it after tracking it. I quickly sprinted to the kitchen and picked up a knife. I heard the man giggling quietly as he tried to use his teeth to pick up the bone while I was running. I hurried back into the living room as soon as I got the knife off the counter, only to see him facing away from me, his furry back and tail hanging from pools of blood where the staple had pierced his flesh. I immediately grabbed the knife and stabbed him in the back as hard as I could. He yelled loudly, dropped the bone, and scampered over to the dog door. Blood started to splatter and seep out of his dirt-covered body as I dashed back towards him and repeatedly stabbed him in the flesh. As he tried to crawl out the door, I continued stabbing and stabbing, feeling nothing but excitement pumping through my body. To make sure I would put an end to it permanently, I used all of my might to flip him over and started stabbing his chest and stomach. My rage was fueled by all those terrifying nights, which made me push harder with every stab. His once innocent eyes were now filled with fear and the knowledge of death, as blood started to pour from his mouth. At last, I paused and got up to see him as he lay there trembling and struggling to breathe due to the volume of blood leaking into his lungs. "Okay, what on earth are you doing?" I looked into his terrified eyes and asked. "Your closest companion. Being a good guy was my goal." He gave a wheeze. "My best friend is gone, and you sure as hell are not him," I said, putting my hands tightly around the knife to deliver the fatal blow after giving him a brief moment of my attention. I quickly sank the knife deep into his chest till the only thing left in the room was my breathing. The nightmare was over. When I phoned the police after getting up, they were as perplexed as I was. We stared at the body of the man who used to sit at my door expecting for some sick reward, and they asked the same questions that I couldn't answer. I still don't know why he did this or how long he stayed there. After everything, the dreams continued, and I still see and miss my dear friend every other night. Without Apollo and my parents, life is difficult, and I would stop at nothing to see them again. Although I would like for those dreams to come true, I will continue to hold on to them in light of the realities I have been witnessing lately.